Welcome, everyone. We're a smaller group today because I know quite a few people were off. I thought we could use today to have a conversation that we started in Slack that talks about what kind of data that the documentation we're producing, what does it apply to, and also what would be a name that we could use to sort of represent this particular area of knowledge. I could start off by summarizing some of what was talked about in Slack. There were a couple of terminology that were put forth. So I have been referring to it as authoritative data. And I know that traditionally authority data is what was used. And part of my reasoning for using authoritative is because we don't just work with authority data. But someone else pointed out to me that authoritative implies a certain amount of truth to the data that may not actually be what applies in this case, that this is almost more of a blessed data, that it has been reviewed and a group of knowledgeable people have reviewed the data and have decided that it is has worth and function. And so one of the other complexities to it is that we have sort of traditional authority data that's like coming from LOC, and we also have bibliographic data that comes from like shared EDE and again from LOC when they do works and instances. And so one of my questions is, should this change management documentation apply to those two sets of data? And are there other sets of data that it would also apply to? And then again, coming back to this notion of, do we have a name that would sort of encompass all of this? So that's the intro that I have. There's a little more conversation going on in Slack, but why don't we just open it up for conversation at this point?
Well, I guess one thing that occurred to me with Vitus's initial Slack message is that to some extent, we're talking about a very focused scope search engine. If you want to think about it that way, in terms of some of the granularity is down to, say, an authority record. But for the bibliographic stuff or for some of the wiki data things, I mean, they're general RDF descriptions of an arbitrary entity out in the real world. So the prospect of a general service here really kind of entails the ability to return structured information where the structure in some cases is very lean, the context of an authority instance, or very rich and complex in the context of a wiki data entry.
What Dave said is very true, and that's one of the challenges of exchanging data in this new environment, is that unlike in the mock environment, there is less agreed upon structure as to what the data should be like, and so you have much greater variety, and making it a lot more difficult for the receiving system to know what to expect and how to make use of the received data. There is effort underway in trying to see if we can specify some kind of exchange format to make it somewhat easier to exchange data. But we're only at the very beginning of that, and there's nothing in place right now.
So we're looking basically at the first steps towards what we could call semantic search engines, where our use cases right now are very focused, but as the number of sources gets enriched and as we federate things.
I think Dave may have frozen on us. So hopefully Dave will be able to join back in. So to just sort of summarize what I've heard so far, we have fairly straightforward data like in AgriVoc and some of the other authorities, and then we have some really complex data like Wiki Data and also I would say the bibliographic data. And so I'm wondering, are there other kinds of data that we would envision that the change management documentation that we're creating would apply to?
Well, I think maybe the shared VDE CKB data would be a good example to talk about this, and that is would Tiziana or Jim, would you consider that authority data, or how would you characterize the data that you have in the that you're accumulating in the CKB? Or is it more descriptive data of entities?
Currently, we are trying to oversee the term bibliographic or authority, and usually speaking about CKB, we speak about entity data, because this has not a connotation about the quality of data, but for sure about the structure of data, the focus that we put on data. That is not something like a bibliographic record, a flat bibliographic record or an authority record, but is a description about an entity. So right now we are trying to use this entity data term to refer to the CKB. Of course, probably we should think about the classification, the objective of something that is from a qualitative viewpoint, something that is checked. So something, because authoritative means something that has a control beyond or behind. While we currently we don't have this distinction between something that come from a bibliographic or come from an authority record. So currently we are speaking about entity data.
Yeah, but I think all the sources that we have mentioned, like LC, ShareVD, OCLC, and the PCC, they are all from organizations that are curating this data, and they do provide some kind of quality assurance. And that's why we're interested in using them instead of just anything out there. We want to access data that are from these organizations, because we know that they represent certain quality or certain standard in terms of the kind of data that you're able to get from them.
Yeah, so I wonder, excuse me, I wonder also about authorities, certainly things that we've been calling authorities that are like ISNI or VIAF, where they're bringing more data in from other sources, but we still access them and think about them in terms of like changes that might have happened to a particular record that they're holding. But I don't know, would you refer to those as authority data, or would you have another term for that? Welcome back, Dave. I
Sorry.
had just posed the question. So we're sort of talking about the different like kinds of data, and one of the things that I brought up that I'm not sure fits into like authority data or bibliographic data or descriptive data is ISNI and VIAF that kind of pull together. You know, my understanding is that they're like almost like a thesaurus of types, because you come in with one URI and you can then find other URIs that are similar, have similar nature, especially in VIAF. I don't know ISNI quite as well, but I was under the impression that ISNI did something similar.
Yeah. So the whole same as assertion notion that VIAF gives you, I mean, we do kind of have an equivalent problem when you start aggregating Vivo data, because you'll have a URI for a co-author in one Vivo site that actually has an authoritative URI over in the author's home site. And so Eric Meeks at UCSF and I have worked on something called crosslinks, which basically tries to say, oh, this URI is actually this person over here. So you can actually jump through that hoop. And when you dereference it, you can get to the actual home of the data, as opposed to a partial clone of the data, which is interesting when you start thinking about copy cataloging.
Exactly. When you start exchanging data and having separate multiple nodes of the data in various places, one question that come up is, well, is there a place where it is considered the home of the data, and that's where maintenance should be done, and not in all these places where the data exists in some version. And how do you control that? In terms of Lynette's question of whether what you see in VIAF should be considered authority data, to me VIAF is an aggregation of authority files from many sources, but the focus are these are all authority records.
I completely agree with Vitus. VIAF and also ISNI, because ISNI comes directly from VIAF, and in some cases it uses the same data used for VIAF. But VIAF is absolutely an authority file composed by putting together traditional authority records coming from different sources. And VIAF, from my point of view, is very far from the concept of an entity. The authoritative source that is more close to the concept of an entity and the description of an entity, I'm speaking about the source most used, is Wiki Data now. Wiki Data seems to have the concept of an entity that is described with the various kind of properties and the relationships. While VIAF, ISNI, and also the OCLC project that has the strange name of word identities, put together a lot of information coming from authority record. And if you try to study this kind of sources, this distance from a kind of entity modeling is really present. The only source that I finally, in addition to Library of Congress, loc.gov, the only source that I'm finding really oriented to an entity description is Wiki Data.
So can you clarify that for me? When you were saying OCLC identities represents, and then I thought you spun it around to saying that they're representing the data as entities, but then you just ended with saying that Wikidata was the only one as entities. So I think I kind of missed something there.
No, sorry, I expressed in a bad way. OCLC identities try to present yourself as an entity project, but concretely it works still as a traditional authority. So in case, for example, if you try to disambiguate a person, you find a lot of same as a relationship in terms of strings. This is the same of this in another alphabet, but not enough element to really disambiguate entities. That is completely different. While if you search on Wikidata, you have some elements that make clear this is an entity and this is another entity. It's not so clear in OCLC identities project. Probably this is the beginning. I suppose they will improve the concept of entity or identities. But right now, this is my impression because I studied this different kind of sources, and I find that this precise identification of entity currently is present only in id.log.gov and in Wikidata, not in other sources.
So I wonder if that would be useful to try and put, I wrote down three from the discussion we've been having, and I may have missed something, but I wrote down three sort of categories of data. And I wonder if it would be worth trying to define those and then putting examples of what authority, what I'm using the term very loosely here, what authority data that we've already been working with, how do they fall into these categories? And I imagine there might be some overlap for some of them, that they would fall into more than one, but it would be helpful to me to sort of have a firmer definition for these.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that the focus of authority data or authority record is to define an authorized heading and make that accessible to people who are looking for unauthorized headings. So this focus is quite different from like describing a work or describing an instance.
Or describing a person, because also in case of person, BF, for example, described exactly as Vitus affirmed, described the heading. So try to define which heading is authoritative in a certain context. So which label that is associated to a person, for example, better describe the person or describe the person in a certain context. While when you speak about entity, you find different labels, different headings for the same entity, but you should add a lot of other properties and the relationship to modeling the entity.
So where would you classify person? So we typically refer to you as LOC names as an authority. And by calling it names, I guess they're being descriptive, putting it out there as they're describing a person as opposed to them being a person, which is where we get into all the real world object stuff. So I don't know that I want to go down that, but where would you classify a person? What kind of data would that be? should there be another category to hold like persons and places and things that data that represents physical things? Because like a heading is more descriptive, whereas a person and a place, those are things. We have solid objects that those things represent.
Yeah, and I think we have been stuffing a lot of description related to the person or properties of the person into the authority record. Probably because that's what we have, and that's, you know, it could be useful in establishing the authority as well. Information like, okay, you know, what organization is this person associated with? What work has this person authored? And so on, which are different from the purpose of establishing an authorized heading. But nonetheless, they got included in the same place for convenience or, you know, traditional reasons. That's where you can place descriptions about this person and record that information for future usage. So I think the line is not clear cut between these categories, and but I would reiterate that to me the purpose of having an authority record is to have that authorized heading for use in bibliographic records. And eventually we may move away from that, because the role of the authorized headings would be replaced by the URI being the unique identifier that identify the entity. So there'll be less of a need to have the authorized heading serve that role.
So I wasn't trying to change the subject on you, Vitus. I don't know if you had more thoughts on that. I just added another type because if we define authority data as primarily being around, you know, subject headings that are sort of predefined headings that we want to use in our data to be consistent. And then we sort of separated out things which are person, place, organization type stuff. And then it also occurred to me that we really have some basic controlled vocabularies that we include as well. Some of these are sort of ad hoc ones, but some of them are, you know, put together by organizations who are trying to bring up, to raise and really create terminology around groups of people or places that have been marginalized. So we get some of the terminology vocabularies around Native Americans, and I think it's called homosaurus is one that is not as common. Then we also get things that are like related to video games and some other very specialized topics. And I'm just not sure how those would fall into all this.
But isn't the purpose of all control vocabularies to decide to pick a term to use as the authorized one among, you know, multiple terms that could be could describe that concept or that particular thing? So in that sense, to me, it is similar to the act of establishing an authorized heading for a person. It is to limit the choices to pick one as the official choice.
Right.
So like in a subject vocabulary, there are many words that can describe the same thing, but you declare that this is the one that should be used in the context of this subject vocabulary.
So I guess I'm just trying to tease apart. We started with authority data as being authorized headings, and that's a very specific use of authority data. And then I guess my question really is, are controlled vocabulary a type of authority data? Are there different types of authority data? So there's heading oriented authority data, and then there's terminology oriented authority data. What is it that makes something authority data, or do we need other categories to express this?
Probably we have both, because it depends by the kind of controlled vocabularies. In some cases, as Vitus said before, the controlled vocabulary could be just a list of authorized form of names, of strings, or of headings, while in other cases, the controlled vocabularies is an instrument to list a kind of entities. I try to, I don't know if this is a correct, example, but for example, for Gen form, Jim or other or Vitus, please correct me if it's wrong. For Gen form, we have both. We have the list coming from Mark, that is Mark Gen form, where we have a list of terms that are used to define a kind of general kind of form for a resource. While we have the quite similar list coming from id.loc.gov that refer to a real list of entities that have a URI and have other kind of qualification or other kind of scope in using it. I don't know if this could or not be the correct example.
Just to be clear, are you suggesting that LOC genre form would be another example of authority data that is not heading specific?
Yes, the id.loc.gov, yes. While the Mark genre form list, for me, is more close to a traditional authority source.
So I think the use of the word heading is a misnomer here. And that's because it's too tied to the lexical notion of definition of this as opposed to identity notion. If you step back and think about this abstractly, what you have is a concept hierarchy in LOC subjects or mesh that is controlled by a given entity, in this case, Library of Congress or LOC. Each node in that hierarchy is associated with some conceptual construct. The label for that node historically has been a string, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that it's very linguistically tied. So that if you think about URIs are basically just synthetic identifiers to label that specific node, and then the other things associated with that node effectively become properties driven against that subject URI, against that unique identifier. And that same sort of mapping applies also to real world objects, persons or places or whatever. the prospect of Waterloo. Are you talking about Waterloo, Iowa, or Waterloo, Ontario, or Waterloo in Europe? The label is inherently ambiguous, and controlled vocabularies have just attempted to disambiguate that ambiguous labeling mechanism when you're dealing with the common name that people associate with it. So the prospect here, I think, is getting away from the use of labels like heading and starting to talk about authoritative identity or authoritative reference, right? That's why they talk about universal resource identifiers as URIs. Is it's meant to be an unambiguous synthetic key that carries no semantics of its own, but it's used to hang all of the things that carry semantics off of.
Yeah, I think that is very true, and that's where future cataloging would be done, I think, by using these separate description of entities and extracting what is would be useful for a particular purpose from these multiple descriptions to put together to form a kind of description of a resource.
Yeah.
And so I agree. I think we are on a path of moving away from constructing these labels and using them as identifiers, and instead replacing having that role be served by the URI instead of the label. But you will still need a label. There is no escape from that. Seems like you would still need some kind of consistent label if you want to be able to index your descriptions and to present them to users.
Yes, but what that label is becomes very contextual then, because if the user is a speaker of Farsi, you don't present them with an English label.
Exactly. You would have a lot more flexibility when it comes to the label, and you have choices. You're not tied to the label is also the identifier, so you're restricted to that.
Now, the interesting thing about this using URIs is that we've created an over-specification problem for ourselves. And that is, you think about, say, ORCID, the 4-octet block of the numeric sequence can be used internally within, say, the University of Iowa as a unique identifier for me. And if it's got a prefix of a UIWA domain, it's dereferenceable into UIWA. But if we look at URIs as we've done them, where there's an id.loc prefix on an identifier, the only place we can dereference that through without cheating is through LOC. And so the difficulty is those unique identifiers drive you away from the local platform to a central platform, instead of just allowing you to look things up in the local environment. So it's like we went too specific and looked to the dereferenceable thing. And this is where we fell into the trap of the semantic web stuff, where everything was going to have a home and everything was just a mesh of interconnection, as opposed to localizing information on a local site. So we almost need a grand master VIAF that allows you to pivot from a local and unambiguous key to the shared generic unambiguous key that everybody agrees to.
Yeah, like there are going to be many URIs for the same work.
Right.
There's one in ShareVD, there's one in id.loc.gov, and there's one in Xenopia. and they are all referring to the same work, but they use different URIs for that. And that in itself creates its own a new kind of problem for us, is how to manage these, how to reconcile all these different identifiers for the same thing.
Well, one thing, hi, this is Jim. One thing about Wiki Data is it kind of offers that functionality a little bit, because you can search like a town, an entity, and like you can get all the different identifiers that various place name, like linked data stores have for it. You can get a geo name, so you can get an id.lc.gov, and Wikidata, of course, has its own. But I think Wikidata is an interesting model for that. And what's really kind of interesting to observe about Wikidata is, yeah, you do have the same problem with labels and names, but another thing about Wikidata is you can see how many entities, like how many assertions are related to that place. And that, I think that's both an artifact of like the people working on it, but it also tells you, it also particularly may signal something about that entity you're looking at. So I think the Wikidata infrastructure is pretty interesting. I would also add, like within Sinopia, you can reference, if you want to reference a work ID for a work you have that you're describing, you can go ahead and do that. So it's not necessary, it's not a foregone conclusion that these don't know about each other. Like I could create a Sinopia work record at the same time I could put in the URI for the share VDE work record. And so there's the possibility that that one comes like pre-baked with its linkages inside of it.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think we'll be doing that a lot when we do copy cataloging. Basically, we'll be referring to instance URI in various systems, and at the same time create an instance, or we may be creating an instance record within Sinopia.
So I'm thinking about trying to bring us back around to some of these categories. And I wonder if, because I've heard several times, like some of the things in this list that I've broken out into other places being referred to as also authority data. And so I wonder if to have the heading data, you would have a separate thing that was like heading data and not in, and then sort of identify, yes, heading data is one type of authority data. Person, places, and organizations is another type of authority data when it is curated, and controlled vocabularies is another type of authority data. And also the relational data that's ISNI and VOF was also seen as authority data. So I'm wondering, like, those first 4 things I have listed are all types of authority data. I'm asking that because, Vitus, when we first started, your definition of authority data was that the focus is to define and authorize headings. And I'm wondering if that's too narrow in the way that authority data, when people think of authority data, they think of it as more broad. And so maybe putting that as like heading data, and then we have this sort of umbrella term called authority data that multiples of these fit in.
Yeah, I guess because I'm coming from a traditional cataloging background, when I hear the term authority, I always think of an institution acting as the authority and declaring that you should use this string for this purpose, whether it's a subject heading or whether it's the author of a book or uniform title. That's what, to me, is an authority record. So I'm not very comfortable with using that term to describe the other things that you just mentioned. I'm thinking that maybe there is a better term than authority to describe that sort of relationship or that sort of data.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. No, just to share a thought, because I think that the authority records in MARC 21 started, and for a long time they were exactly a description of a heading. In fact, if you think to the tags that compose an authority record, such as the see also, the 4xx, the 5xx, see also, see this heading, or the source where you found this kind of heading, this form of heading. So a lot of tags refer specifically to the heading. So why you choose this heading in your bibliographic record as authoritative form? Probably when the linked open data development started, I have the impression, but it could be wrong as usual, that MARC 21 tried to adapt itself. And in fact, a lot of different tags were added. For example, occupation, for example, email address. So a lot of attributes that refer not more to the string, but to the thing. So to the person, for example, to the work. So probably also in MARC 21, we can see this kind of transition from something that is the traditional authority, where the record was created to check and to control the string, the heading, and something that I want to describe the entity. So a person, a work, something that is a real world object. So I don't know if you agree in this vision.
I think that is true, but I don't think it is because, well, I don't think it's necessarily because of the wish to transition to link open data, but rather that it grows out of the need to disambiguate.
Ambiguate, yes.
The more information you have about this person, you know, where he or she works, what kind of work she did, and what books has been written, all of that could help to disambiguate this person from the other person who has the same name. So this kind of information get accumulated and stored in the authority record, even though they are more like descriptive information about the person. But they are considered useful in terms of establishing that authorized heading, because very often you would need a qualifier to make that heading unique, and the qualifier would be based on like a birth year, the death year, or occupation, to make it, even though the name is the same, to make it different.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Probably the two courses overlapped occasionally. So just.
Yeah. That's why I think it really is the intent. That's where the difference is, as far as I'm concerned, is that the intention of the authority record is to establish a heading.
Yeah, I agree.
And whereas the intention of an entity's description is to describe the entity, is to have information about this entity, which is unrelated to the establishment of heading.
Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes left. And so I think this was excellent. I feel like I have a firmer grasp on sort of the distinction between some of the data that kind of would be applied to this change management type document. So I'm wondering though, if there's a general term that would be appropriate to sort of capture all of these. We were having that conversation in Slack, and I had put out at one point, do we call it entity data or resource data? And I know that some people, there was at least some that said that that was too broad, that could be any kind of RDF. But some who thought that maybe that is the right way to go. But I'm feeling like calling it authority data is trying to put a whole bunch of other stuff into what is originally and traditionally a more limited scope. And
well, yeah, so I think about this kind of as a graph coloring problem. And so let me try to restructure this, and maybe this is going to answer your question on it. So if you think about the graph, right, where the nodes in the graph are either URIs or literals, right, then a control vocabulary basically only colors subject URIs and literals by means of a property called label or pref label, whatever, right? When you add in the notion of hierarchy, you suddenly pick up what's currently lumped into authority, which means that you now have label edges and you have hierarchical edges in that graph, right? So now control vocabularies and the authority label in this page are really just two restrictions of the overall concept of a set of interlinked subjects and their labels, and nothing else that is present in the graph. When you add the relational stuff, now what you're doing is binding subject URIs as equivalences, right? That's the same as authority. That really only ties the graph together in terms of identities, shared identities, if you will. And then now if you think about what's left is all of the descriptive stuff, right? And that is where the things data, where all the bibliographic data comes from. It has nothing to do with identity. It has nothing to do with the name we put on it, but it's that disambiguation notion of here's how we tell John Smith apart from John Smith. And it's not by the name of the nature of the label or the URI, because the URIs are different, the labels are the same, but now we've got different birth and death dates, say. And we need sufficient contextualization to provide that disambiguation. And that's where those additional properties come from in control vocabularies that sometimes get bubbled up into the label, but that's actually just a way of sort of ad hoc disambiguating. And so I would argue that we've got controlled and the authority categories here as basically identity labeling mechanisms, that the relational category ties aliases together, and that everything else is description.
so I'm pondering, like, I guess I'm sitting here pondering because I like the way you describe that, but I'm trying to think how that pulls us closer to a term that would sort of gather all of the type of data that we're talking about.
Well, I think QA encompasses so much that it would be really difficult to find a name that is descriptive of everything and not be so generic that it becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
Something I heard David say was identities, and I really liked because that's id.lsc.gov. It kind of speaks to a lot of things in there too, and you know, there might be something to that. I was when I put this in chat a while ago, but it's probably hard to keep up. But like I was thinking about like, oh, you know, could we reference an ontology? Well, you know, BitFrame 2.0 offers like agents, subjects, and events. So I don't know if like within a particular ontology, you can say something about that. But yeah, it could be like identities that relate to descriptive metadata, something like that.
I think that entity description or entity metadata, I think that is one of the best option, because authoritative refers to someone who decided which is the best form to identify something, so the best string. Resources refer to the web, the open web, so probably it is too broader. But the entity metadata means that you are already thinking to real world objects that are entities, but you refer to metadata to identify these entities. So because description, descriptive or description in my hand, in my imagination, refer to the traditional flat record, while probably entity metadata put together the concept of description, that is metadata, but of an entity that is a real world object.
I like that term, Tiziana.
So I like the idea of entity. I like the idea of identity. The identity entity. So part of where I'm going with this is I need, like, I'm going to be creating a context. I thought we would get to this before the end. And so this is really too quick to do in the last few minutes. But one of the things we need to do is create a context for the activity stream. And in that, it will give things like our various activities, create and update, split and merge. But we need a namespace for it. So like this is the IIIF's namespace for theirs. And they of course have IIIF as they've been doing lots of things under the term IIIF for a very long time. And so it would be, I'm trying to think ahead to like, as we continue to do this work, is there a name that sort of encompasses it that we can use as a namespace now that we won't look back later and go, boy, I wish I hadn't done that, you know?
But wouldn't the context simply be QA?
Well, I could do something like that, but this particular specification we're putting together isn't just for QA. It's you know, something that Share VDE could use. It's something that that LOC could use. And so I would like it to be more generic so that anyone who comes to this and looks at this reference we're creating says, I see how I can do this with my data. So all these various kinds of data would feel like it fits for them too. And so I'm trying to come up with something general.
Yeah, something I wanted to say about the entities is I think they are descriptions of entities, like, you know, because we have the concept of an entity in our head. But I think when you navigate to a resource, you have a description of it. And so I think it's these are descriptions of entities.
All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and call it because we're at the hour. But this is an excellent start, and maybe we'll just can continue the conversation in Slack and see if we can't coalesce around a term that we can use. And certainly, I think we'll have more voices joining. We were a little small this week because of the holiday in the US. But thank you, everyone, for coming and for the great conversation.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.